Welcome to Beekeeping Today Podcast, presented by Bee Culture, the magazine of American beekeeping. Beekeeping Today Podcast is your source for beekeeping news, information, and entertainment. I'm Jeff Ott.
And I'm Kim Flott, I'm editor of Bee Culture magazine.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Dr. Larry Connor's Wicwas Press. Dr. Connor has published over a dozen titles dealing with bees, beekeeping, queen rearing, and pollination. At the Wicwas Press site, you'll find a great selection of must-have books for beekeepers and people who love honeybees, such as Foraging Afar by William Bloomquist, Beecabulary Essentials by Andrew Connor, Garden Plants for Honeybees by Peter Lintner, Increase Essentials and Queen Rearing Essentials by Dr. Connor, and Swarm Essentials by Steve Rapaski with Dr. Connor. All of these and more are at www.wicwas.com. That's www.wicwas.com. And while you're there, be sure to thank Dr. Connor for sponsoring the Beekeeping Today podcast.
Well, we have with us today Shane Gebauer. He's with the Brushy Mountain Bee Farm. He's the general manager and president.
Yeah, we're kind of lucky to get Shane today, Jeff. He's a busy guy, but I got to tell you, he and I spend a lot of time working together, primarily at Mother Earth News Fairs. We've been at several of them together. We've done some crazy things with some of those things, I think, sometimes. We took a frame of bees into a crowd of 1,000 people once just to see if we could do it, and we did, and nobody died. But the last one that we were at Seven Springs, and we were doing a beginner's class, an all-day beginner's class, and then the next few days of the fair, Shane had a display, and I was giving a couple talks. And during one of the free times we had, we got to talking about all the new beekeepers that are coming in, because there's a lot of them. I don't know if you remember, Jeff, when we were talking to Tony, how big her beginner classes were in D.C., and I was talking to her just this last weekend. She's got over 400 people in her beginner's class, and that's just Washington, D.C. So the numbers of new beekeepers, what's the word? Extraordinary, amazing, and I think Shane hit on something there with that many people coming in. Are we as an industry dealing with that fact correctly, and is there going to be some ramifications if we don't? Shane, what do you think?
Well, first, it's great being here with you. It's always a pleasure. And I might add, Kim, not only did no one die when we brought that frame out, I don't think anyone got stung except for maybe you or I. So it was a success by every measure when we did that. These new beekeepers. So, probably what was it, 7-8 years ago, we started to see a lot of media attention given to the bee industry. And of course, nightly news, major newspapers, even the cover of Time magazine has featured beekeeping. And when you're out in front of the general public like that, sort of day in and day out, you start to get some attention. And so we started to see these people that we haven't seen in the past coming to us with really great intentions, taking up the plight of the honeybee, really trying to champion the cause. And so there was this huge influx of beekeepers, and it still continues, as you noted. And so what are the consequences of that? Are we dealing with them properly? I've been to talks and seminars and workshops, etc. And we all go out, we socialize, and sitting around the table, I've heard what I'll consider veteran beekeepers sort of lamenting the fact that it's really difficult to deal with these new beekeepers. And it's true. And so how can we do that better? What are the issues, and how can we address them?
Shane, I want to interrupt you for half a second here. What you bring up, I was talking earlier today with Jim Tu, who used to be the extension specialist here at The Ohio State University. And this very topic came up, and we're looking at the extension role of dealing with not only new beekeepers, but existing beekeepers, and teaching them how to do it better, faster, whatever. And there isn't a plethora of extension people out there anymore either.
And they're getting fewer.
Yes. So there's that vacuum that's being formed at the same time that all of this influx is coming in. I don't know. What do you think about all of that?
I think it's a challenge. So we've got these new beekeepers coming in, and we're in a digital age, right? So where are they going to get their information? They're going to the internet. And if it's on the internet, we all know it's true, right? And so they're getting all these different messages, and they're trying to make sense of it. And if you're given, and I go back to the statement that I made a little earlier, which is they have really good intentions. They want to do what's right by the honeybee. And so if you're given the option of reading through some of this information, and there's sort of this one group saying, you don't need to use medications, you can run treatment-free bees. And then you've got another group that's saying, you can't have treatment-free bees. You've got to be management intensive and use some of these miticides, no matter how benign some of them may be. If you're an unknowing, interested hobbyist, you're going to gravitate towards that side that says this is a little bit more natural. This is a little bit easier on the bees. And I think the issues that we're seeing is that that's really, really hard. And that message is not conveyed in these blogs or internet forums where these people are going to get this information. I think you and I, Kim, have talked about some of these folks that promote treatment-free and actually are doing it successfully. But even as they present it at, say, a EAS or a state meeting or even a local county meeting, they're not portraying the management aspect. They're not portraying that they're not making the connection that treatment-free is not management-free. And so consequently, we've got a lot of beekeepers out there that are really struggling, and that's creating some rift, let's say, between those new beekeepers and the more seasoned beekeepers. And now we're getting this polarization. And it's a real issue that we've got to overcome. We've got to work collaboratively within this industry to ensure that we're all doing a better job. Because ultimately, if I'm a bad beekeeper and I'm down the road from you, my inability to maintain a healthy hive will have direct impacts on my surrounding beekeepers. We know this, right? The Varroa bomb that's gotten attention over the past few years.
I want to bring up something, Jeff. Do you have a cat or a dog?
A dog, sort of, yes.
You have a dog, sort of?
A dog lives with us, okay? How about that? Okay.
Okay. And Shane, I know you've got animals. You have a mini farm. I've got 2 cats. What surprises me, I know this when people are coming in and just starting out, what surprises me is that if you take it another step and you ask if you have a dog or a cat, many, not all, but many of them are going to go, yes, I do. And my next question is, do you not treat your cat for fleas? Do you not treat your dog for the diseases that dogs can get, preventative or treatment when they're, when they come down with them? And often the answer is, well, of course. And what I don't see is that connection between my cat and my bees. So they're both pets, if you will. They're both inhabitants on your property, however you want to look at it. But the connection isn't being made. And do you see that? Does that make sense to you?
I was going to say cats and bees. They're both semi-domesticated too. They're not. they're both just inches away from being feral.
Yeah, but when my cat gets fleas, I get fleas.
That's true.
And when my bees get mites, your bees are going to get mites if you live next to me. So there's a connection there. That anyway. Interrupt you there, Shane.
No, it's fine. I agree that there is sort of, if you think about it that way, it's rather obvious, right? Yes, of course, I want to be proactive in maintaining a healthy colony of bees. I think the disconnect is that many of those cats, those dogs are in our homes. And as you mentioned, if they get fleas, you get fleas. And of course, that's not desirable by any stretch of the imagination. And so you're going to be a bit more engaged with that process than perhaps your beehive that's in your backyard that mites aren't going to start infiltrating your carpeting. The other thing is, despite the fact that many of these folks really do view their colonies, their bees, as pets, it's interesting that how the attachment, but yet there's still that notion that these are sort of wild creatures, right? They should be able to go out and get the resources that they need and survive on their own. After all, aren't they living in tree hollows on their own without human management? So why should I be so engaged and intensive with my management of the colony that's in my backyard? And I think that that's sort of the cause of the disconnect. But the problem, again, is that, and this is information that you've provided me over the years, Kim. When I first started in this industry, you said, well, the average beekeeper stays in this hobby about, what was it? I think 5 to 7 years, you said. And now the average beekeeper is in it, a little bit less than 3 years. Why is that? What's going on? And I think it's a direct cause of this notion that hands-off management, treatment free, the bees should be able to survive on their own. And I think it's really creating problems. And the fact that that some of our seasoned beekeepers are, rather than embracing these new beekeepers, sort of frowning on them, well, they're just going to kill bees, rather than trying to really sort of mentor them, we're creating this rift, and it's going to be this reinforcing cycle that we're going to have to deal with.
Do you make a distinction between the sustainable bee and the treatment-free bee?
So help me understand what you mean by sustainable.
Well, the sustainable,
you and I might think about it differently.
Well, true. What they're calling sustainable honeybee in the Pacific Northwest would be, what I understand, it sounds pretty much like a treatment-free, but that's what I was actually looking to see if there is a distinction between it. Whereas a sustainable might be managed to keep the traits that are keeping the bees healthy with minimal treatments or no treatments. Maybe there's a fine line that different groups are drawing in that distinction.
I'll throw in another definition of sustainable here, and then we'll get back to you, Shane. Just because there's a couple of ways to go. This past weekend we had our My Story event here in Medina, and one of our speakers was Mike Palmer, and Mike Palmer's talk was essentially the sustainable bee yard. And his definition of sustainable certainly includes mite treatments. His definition of sustainable goes in using his bees to replace bees that he sells, to replace bees that are lost for whatever reason, so that he doesn't have to buy bees and bring new bees into his operation, and the bees that he's producing, he's selecting for the traits that he wants to be desirable. But mite treatments are a part of that program.
Yeah, and so my view of sustainable beekeeping more closely follows what Mike Palmer what you said he was discussing this past weekend. Sort of working with the resources that you've got currently in your operation to sustain that operation, whether it be you are producing nukes as he does to sell off bees, or selling honey, or anything else to generate a revenue source that allows you to buy additional colonies, expand, etc. Or if you're just sort of trying to maintain status quo, so to speak, but you're making a couple splits, you're overwintering them, and those splits then help replace some of the dead outs that are inevitable as you go through winter. And not having to buy bees from Georgia or California. It's all self-contained, and that's kind of where I fall down on the sustainable beekeeping spectrum. But I think there's, as you were suggesting, Jeff, there's you've got treatment-free, you've sort of got sustainable, and I'm not quite sure what's at the other end of the spectrum, but I think it's a spectrum. And I want to be clear here that I'm not saying that treatment-free is impossible. But what's lost is that it it takes a lot of work. I mean, a lot of work. You have to be very, very diligent about your management and follow some pretty strict protocols, whether it be constant requeening, whether it be drone trapping, whatever else you want to employ to keep the mite populations down. But it takes a lot of work, and I would say 99.9% of the new beekeepers don't realize the amount of effort that would have to go into making it being successful as a so-called treatment-free. And so consequently, their colonies die. And it's interesting too. I don't want to necessarily call out some products, but I think that there's some marketing that goes on in our industry for certain items that say, this is going to basically low impact on the bees. It's more natural. It's easier. And easier isn't necessarily better in all cases. You've got to know what's going on inside your hive. You can't just look at it from the outside and admire it. You've got to get in there and look to see what's going on. And
you've never seen my hives, Shane. My hives are made to be looked at.
I tell people, don't ever come into my bee yard because it's a complete disaster. It's a mixture of all different types of stuff, and do as I say, not as I do, type of thing.
There you go. That's good.
But I think they have good intentions, but we need to sort of help them along a little bit more. It's interesting, Bee Informed Partnership, which is I think one of the best organizations out there that we've seen in a long time, because they're doing a lot of great data collection that's providing some insight into the industry. If you look at the percent of loss by beekeeper type, the hobby beekeepers are by far the highest, and yet it's often the commercial beekeepers that are vilified for killing colonies because they're trucking them around the country and stressing them and working them too hard, etc. But that it's not really the case. It's the hobby beekeepers that as a percent of operation are causing more colonies to die. And why is that? And it's also interesting too. I'm going to get myself in a little hot water here, I'm afraid, but it wouldn't be the first time. There's this sort of saying amongst more seasoned beekeepers in the industry that say, the most knowledgeable beekeeper is the second year beekeeper, because they've started a colony and they sort of make it through that first season, and oftentimes that colony overwinters fairly well, and they come through and say, gosh, this isn't that hard. What's all the fuss about? And, now they're thinking they're experts and trying to teach classes and such. But again, going back to the Bee Informed Partnership data, if you look at of losses based on the number of years of keeping bees, it's that second year beekeeper that typically has the highest losses, because they come through winter and now suddenly those mites are through the roof and they're not doing anything to manage them. And the colony starts collapsing either early or late summer. Maybe you're lucky enough to get it to winter, but it rarely will survive winter if nothing's done. And again, I don't want to sound negative. I want to be the counter to that, because as I said, some of the beekeepers that I've talked to that even teach beginning classes have said, I can't wait for the beginner beekeeping bubble to burst so that we don't have to deal with these issues anymore. And I think that's totally the wrong approach. We need every beekeeper we can get. What we need to do, the approach that we need to have is, how can we work together so that everyone's a better beekeeper? And that's what we have to do. I don't have the answer to that. Kim, do you have the answer?
Sure I do, Shane. Just ask.
I just did.
I'll dwell on some of the issues that you've just brought up. When you look at the number of these new beekeepers who subscribe to either of the journals, who belong to any of the local associations, who even get the newsletters from the association, whether they go to the meetings or not. It is, he says carefully, pitifully small. And is it because, as you say, I learned it on the internet? I watched The Naked Beekeeper, and he showed me everything I need to know. Or is it because, well, I'm just naturally smart? I don't know the reason, but you bring up a point, is that the industry isn't working hard enough to probably make this work for new beekeepers, and new beekeepers are. I'll go back to one of the things that Jim Tu and I were talking about this morning when we were saying this, is that we're getting away from, if you go back 50 years, we had a lot of extension and a lot of association people, and lots of people belong to associations. And now we're getting into the age of Amazon. Things are either really, really big or really, really small. And the middle of the road is getting much wider with nobody on it. As I said, there's no extension, or very little university extension, especially works with local beekeeper level anymore. Medina County hasn't had a bee extension person for maybe ever, or certainly a long time since I've been here. So part of it is, you mentioned the internet. Where am I getting my information? And how do you police the internet? That's another question.
Yeah, I didn't hear the answer to my question. I mean, that's a very good question that you just posed back to me, but I didn't hear an answer to my question. And but I think you illustrate the problem is, how do you reach these people?
Yep.
Because so how many beekeepers are there in Ohio? And how many attended Ohio State Beekeepers Conference?
Yep, a tiny fraction.
A tiny fraction.
Yeah.
And the subscriber base to your magazine, we don't know how many hobby beekeepers there are in the United States, but we're guessing a few 100,000 maybe. And I am willing to bet that you would love to have each and every one of them subscribing to your magazine, but I'm also willing to bet that you don't, and that you also have a tiny fraction of that potential pool of subscribers.
And talking with some industry people this weekend, I was at the NAPSI meeting, the National Association of Pollinator Protection, and there were people from all over the pollinator industry, not only just bees and beekeeping, but bumblebees and all of the rest. And in talking to several commercial beekeepers and a couple of equipment people, the discussion turned to that exact topic: how many beekeepers are there? And listening to a couple of people who know more than I do about how many customers are out there buying things, somebody at that meeting said 1 million. And it was almost convincing.
Huh.
So your several 100,000 is certainly realistic. And you're correct. I do not have several 100,000 subscribers.
Well, I would imagine both examples that you'd be, like Shane was saying, on either end. You have the 1 and 2, 3 year beekeeper, then you have the long-term beekeeper, but in between, there's not a whole lot of people in between, both for the subscription and or doing all the other participation in associations and everything else.
Yeah, they tend to get in, and 1 year they lose bees. Okay, I'll try it again. The second year they lose bees, and maybe they go for a third round. But after 3 years, if you lose bees each year, you're gonna start to question whether this is the correct hobby for you to be pursuing.
And there's always a spouse in the background going, I thought we were going to make money doing this.
It's coming, dear. It's coming.
Or at least some honey with this.
Yeah. That's my saving grace, is that I keep her in honey that she likes to drink her coffee. So yes, you're exactly right, Jeff. And then maybe there's a small percentage that are successful and do persist, and they carry on and become some of those more seasoned beekeepers that can can turn to the new beekeepers and help them if they remember sort of the troubles that they had getting into it, and know that those beekeepers are experiencing those same troubles now. And I think a lot of them just say, oh, well, it's that treatment free. I don't want to, there's no getting through to them. There's no reasoning with them. There's no having a rational conversation with them. And so they tend to turn their back and go about their business. And again, I just think that it's totally wrong.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to work together.
Well, I'll add one more level to this. We've had Varroa for 30 years.
Yeah.
And we are no closer to solving that problem than we were the day it marched across the border, whatever border it was that it marched across, but we're no closer. We don't have predictably resistant bees. We have some that are tolerant. Sometimes they're wonderfully resistant, and then we have to requeen, and that goes away. So I'll go to one of I'm not going to say failures, but one of the issues that we have is from the top down is that the research to solve these problems hasn't occurred. And it hasn't occurred because of funding, because of what? Are researchers going in different directions that aren't solving that problem? Absolutely, but they're solving other problems. Mm-hmm. So there isn't an easy. We should not be debating treatment free after 30 years. There should be a management issue and a resistance issue that makes this a moot point. But we are no closer today than we were 30 years ago.
So I almost think there's a bit of a contradiction there, Kim. So you say that we're no closer than we were 30 years ago, but if I heard you correctly, you said we should be talking about, if I understood what you said correctly, that the bee losses would be a management issue or a resistance issue. Is that sort of what you were alluding to?
Well, I would like to think that it was. I mean, corn farmers deal with corn borer. I mean, they have every stalk of corn would have corn borers if they weren't managing them, yet they don't.
Well, but I think we can. And I think that's sort of the point here is that we can deal with Varroa through management. But one of the issues is we're not. And I'm guilty of that as well. And I'm not trying to be this so-called treatment free. I'm a busy guy traveling with two kids that like to play every sport they possibly can at every instant in time. And so it's difficult to build beekeeping into that schedule. And so consequently, I've been negligent in management at certain times. And so I'm guilty of it too. But I think that there are the proper tools, the necessary tools to maintain healthy hives. It's just that those tools, that management isn't being implemented. For whatever reason. Maybe it's a case of lack of time in mind. Maybe it's the case of misinformation with some, or I don't know what else. But I think we've got what it takes.
Jeff, you're getting back into bees here.
Yes.
And you belong to a local club. What are you picking up at that level?
Well, I think that's part of where the basis of my sustainability question. I hear more talk about sustainability here than treatment free. Maybe I'm not sitting in the right part of the room to hear that discussion.
Well, so I almost think though, Jeff, that and as we talked about how I envision sustainable beekeeping, I almost see that as separate from the management of the colonies. I mean, yes, there's definite connection between the two, but I can have really poor management and lose a ton of colonies. But if I'm making a ton of splits to replace them, or I'm breeding stock, then I'm maintaining my numbers, but I'm also killing a lot of bees because I'm not managing them properly. Now, there's certainly a case to be made that if I'm making those splits, that's going to have a beneficial effect for the health of the colony, because I'm going to get some new queens in those splits, and there'll be a broodless period, which will help with Varroa control, etc. But I think there's a difference between good management and being a sustainable beekeeper. And just because you're sustainable doesn't mean you're a good manager. It
Right.
sort of suggests you might be, but it's not a one-to-one correlation, I think.
I agree. I think the management's a whole. It's a broad topic that covers everything. I mean, last episode we had Dan Conlon on talking about Russian bees, and one of the key takeaways he had there was that you can't just walk away from them and expect them to be like Italians. There is a management. There are issues with Russian bees, but and that can be addressed through management practices. And what I've seen often, and if I am observing wrong, then it's my fault, not the people here. But I would think that what I'm observing is that a lot of the new beekeepers think through this. I don't want to call it treatment free, but back to nature, the natural beekeeping approach fails because bees require management. It's hot, it's sticky, it's stingy, that comes up quite a bit. So I think the management issue kind of overlays everything. And if treatment free requires or sustainability, they all require management. No one's going to, all of them at this point require management of the colony to maintain it. I think that's really what we're coming down to in this, isn't it?
I think so. And while you were saying that, I sort of flashed on the argument that I often hear, which is, well, colonies are living out in tree hollows all on their own.
Mm-hmm.
So why should I, without management, right? So why should I have to manage my colony that's in my backyard? And I'm gonna steal something that I've heard Kim say in the past, and that is that you're accepting that responsibility, right? You're accepting, you're bringing those bees into your backyard, and thus are accepting the responsibility for their welfare. You could make an argument that, we were talking about, other animals, other livestock that people may keep. And, I raise pigs, right? And so I'm bringing those into my pasture and I'm accepting responsibility, but there's wild boar that are roaming through various parts of the United States that don't have any sort of management, but I'm having to manage my pigs because they're in my care. And I think that we have to recognize that this is a decision as beekeepers that we've made to bring these creatures, these marvelous creatures, into our lives, and therefore are responsible for them.
One of the things that enters in here with this, I mentioned Tony's beginners class, 400 beekeepers in DC. In the real world, there aren't 400 colonies in that small of an area. So
very good point.
Very artificial. Tom Seeley's work has shown that when you have one natural colony in a tree about every square mile, your isolation acts as a strong protectant. Those colonies do die, but not as often as the ones that aren't isolated and they're sitting on top of each other. So you've got Tony doesn't teach 400 people. She has that many people sign up. I want to be clear on that. But the fact that many people signed up tells you something. If you put 400 beekeepers, you've got a very broad, flat bell curve of skill. And even taking a beginner's class, you're not gonna do a lot to reduce that flatness in that bell curve for the first couple of years until people get some experience. Hopefully, whenever you have a beginner's class, no matter where you're doing it, that's the stress point. But there are so many stress points when you're beginning bees, feeding, and there's just a lot of information to pack on. And then you go to a monthly meeting, and it's nothing but Varroa, nothing but Varroa, nothing but Varroa. I'm not going back anymore. So you're between a rock and a hard place, trying to get information into the hands of the people who need it, and at the same time, not discourage them from doing it at all.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure what to say about that, but I agree that, and I've been guilty of it as well. because Varroa is such an important topic and does account for, I think, the vast majority of our problems, that it tends to be where the focus is. And I think you're right. There's a whole other, there's a lot more to beekeeping than just managing Varroa. And you mentioned feeding, and nutrition is also important. Making sure that they've got what they need to survive. There's been times where we've handed out packages in March or April, and it's sleet and freezing rain here at the business, and you think, gosh, these people are going to take these bees home, and the forecast isn't much better for the next several days, and what's going to happen to these bees? And brand new beekeepers don't know how to deal with that. Some experienced beekeepers have a hard time with that. And so there is a lot more to beekeeping than just Varroa management. There's the overall management of the colony, and we can't forget that either. And I think that also plays into the whole new beekeeper aspect, again, because these bees, they're going off, they're getting what they need, so they, I shouldn't have to feed them, because they should be able to get the resources that they need on their own, not recognizing that there's been a drought or excessive rain, or a large area was logged and thus changed habitat, and forage is different. And there's a lot of aspects that need to be considered there as well.
So what have we accomplished, Jeff?
Well, nothing is easy. Nothing is free. You have to work for the good things.
Let me write these down. These are good.
Yeah, this is deep right now. I gotta remember this stuff.
So is there room here to say you can't have bees until you've passed this class?
Oh, don't do that. No, don't. What are you trying to get the podcast banned in all countries? Don't even go down that road. I think we should strongly encourage mentorship by a knowledgeable beekeeper. A class alone will not make a beekeeper. You need to be looking into a hive with a knowledgeable and experienced beekeeper. You need to ask the questions as you see it. Watching a video or watching a YouTube or anything, I mean, those are good on a rainy day, but I think you need to follow it up with a good mentor.
Yeah, finding a good mentor is always a challenge. The issues that we went through with the program here was we could find mentors that you could call after supper. But during the day, I'm at work, so that's not going to work. I can only come out 3 nights. You can come over to my place and help me work. That often works. And
I'm seeing a new retirement scheme forming right now. Hire a mentor.
There you go. But getting a mentor and a mentee together is often a challenge, because the mentors, I'm not a commercial beekeeper. I got a job. I got a family. I got, all of the other community responsibilities, just like all of us here do. So suddenly I got somebody calling me up. Oh my God, I just saw, and can you come over and look? And no, I can't, and so getting a program like that organized in an association is going to require 2 things: available people, which there are. But it's the organization of it and the management of that organization over time. You need a central person that can take a call and say, well, Mike can't make it tonight, but George can. He'll be over about 6:30, something like that. But again, it's organization and who has the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you're going to miss a lot of beekeepers, because as we said earlier, how many beekeepers in the state of Ohio, and how many attend meetings? A small percentage, and chances are the percentage that is attending, they're probably doing a little bit better. I'd like to think anyway, they're doing a little bit better than those that are not attending, because they're getting some information and they're able to incorporate that information into their management. I think the broader issue is, how do you reach those folks that choose not to attend those meetings, choose not to subscribe to a magazine, and do largely just sit at home and get their information off the internet? I think that honestly, as a package, someone that's selling packages and nucleus hives, we have to do better, because ultimately those people are going to come to me and to other supply companies and to other beekeepers to get those bees, to get started. And that may be the only point of contact that we could have with them to have a meaningful connection and have some influence over their future actions and where they get their information. Now, I don't again suggest that I've got the solution of what that looks like, because it's difficult on those days when packages are being distributed. But I think that that's probably the best opportunity to reach the most beekeepers that are getting started in this industry.
I was going to say that, not necessarily to put a plug in for Brushy Mountain, but I bought 2 packages in Wilsonville, just by Portland last spring, and I've always been impressed with the Brushy Mountain. About the same time, there's always seminars and guest speakers that are either sponsored by the store down there, or they're highly publicized. And I think that's really good that you're providing at the time when you're getting beekeepers established and started. There's a wealth of information.
One of the things about small businesses is that you're exactly right, Shane. That's the one-to-one contact. Amazon doesn't have that. If I want to buy 10 supers from Amazon, I got nothing from them other than a package 3 days later. If I go to my local bee supply dealer, the guy down the street who's running it out of his garage, and he's open from 10 to 6 on Saturdays, I can go down there and pick his brain. Mm-hmm. And he's going to give me some information, or one of the people working for him. And there may be an opportunity that we are missing. Are those smaller businesses missing an opportunity and saying, once a month I'm going to have a class. It's going to cost you $10, but you're going to learn about varroa, and you're going to learn about feeding, and you're going to learn about wintering. And yes, I'm going to have customers, but I'm easy to get to. I'm here when you need me, and I'm giving you information that you can use, that you can ask me a question and I can give you an answer. Maybe that's something that more people should be exploring.
Well, I can tell you that we've got some of those people as dealers, and the ones that tend to take that approach are more successful than the ones that are just, I'm just selling stuff. The ones that are engaged with their customer base, offering those sorts of learning opportunities, they get a loyal customer that comes back time and time again and buys that merchandise. Now, it can get overwhelming real quick, but in the long run, I think it's beneficial.
Well, and you've got that customer 2 years, 3 years, 7 years down the road. Yep. You got, right. That is a sustainable business.
Yes.
2 years in and out, that customer's gone. So it kind of lends itself here. Shane and Jeff, we're running short of time.
Yepper.
And we all got other jobs to do. So Shane, this has been fascinating. I'm hoping that we can get you back here again and maybe explore this a little bit further. Jeff, what do you think?
I appreciate Shane being here this afternoon and taking the time to speak with us. Is there any last thing you'd like to say, Shane, before we sign off for the day?
I guess first off, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. The last thing that I would say is that beekeeping's not easy. It does take some work. It's a lot like doing puzzles, I think, and that's one of the things that I really like about it, because everyone's going to approach that puzzle differently. But when you go into a hive and you're trying to understand what's going on, you look for your anchor pieces of information, the ones that are really big and glaring. And those are your corners of a puzzle. And then you start to fill in with the edges and the pieces in between. And suddenly, as you put together the various bits of information, you see the picture that the bees are trying to paint for you. And then once we understand that, we can start to take some action and work with the bees, not against them, and certainly help manage and facilitate a good, healthy hive. But it does take getting in there and starting to assemble those pieces of information to understand what's going on. And if we do that, I think we'll do much better.
That's a great analogy. I haven't heard that before, but that's a good analogy, is the corners, start with the corners.
Start with the corners.
Yep, that's good. All right. Shane, again, thank you for being here. Anything else, Jeff?
No, it's been a fun time, and Shane, I appreciate your being here this afternoon, and look forward to talking to you again.
Likewise, thank you very much.
All right. Well, Kim, a couple of weeks ago, we had Dan Conlon on the podcast talking about the Russian bees. And we had a couple questions come in concerning the aggressiveness of the Russian stock. So the other day I called him up, and he said he'd be happy to reply to Larry's question. Let's listen to that now. And so I got Dan on the phone here, and we're going to talk about give him an opportunity to reply. And the first question here is, and this really sums it up, and this is from Larry Carbaugh. And he just writes, I've been told that Russian bees are just hot African bees. Is that so? So how do you reply to questions like that, Dan?
Well, first, that's not the case. Russian bees don't come from that part of the world. They come from the Primorsky region. But I would say that Russians are no more hot than other types of bees. I've kept bees for 50 years, and I've been keeping Russian bees exclusively for the last, I'm going to say, 6 years. And, we don't see them as excessively aggressive or defensive. And I've had plenty of hot hives that were Italian in the past, or Carniolans in the past. So, you're always going to have some of that within your apiary. But I think a lot of it's more the conditions that the bees are exposed to. We know that there's sort of common triggers that all bees, Russian or others, Italians or Carniolans, are all stimulated by. And when they're stimulated with a threat, they release alarm pheromone, the so-called banana smell you smell in the air. Vibrations from a lawnmower might set them off. And when they do that, they're going to go towards your head because they can sense the carbon dioxide. They get in your hair, so they're going to sting you. And they seem to target darker colors. So if you just sort of think about that, you can avoid some of the potential stings.
And that's just standard beekeeping practice, really.
Yeah, and I think that's true of all bees, not just Russian bees. And I also think that, something that certainly newer beekeepers forget is some of this behavior is kind of seasonal. It's you start out with a package of bees and a small nuke hive to start your bees. Well, those are fewer bees. They're young bees. They haven't built up too much. They're really pretty easy to work with. And as they grow and you get into the midsummer, end of summer with 2 deep boxes full of bees and some 40,000 workers in there, you've got a different beehive you're dealing with. And you've got a lot more guard bees to cope with, and you've got a lot more, need to be careful how you handle those bees. And that's just a growth thing with the population. The thing we saw in the Northeast this year was we had about a month of above 90 degrees with high humidity. That's so rare out here. But if you're looking in the bee yards, the bees were just sort of hanging there doing very little in a period of July and August that normally I would say have had a decent nectar flow. That really caused the bees to be much more defensive because if you opened a hive and exposed honey, the robbing would start. They'd release the pheromone and the yard would go up. And so we had to be very careful of working the bees. But I don't think that was unique to the Russian bees, because other beekeepers I know were saying the same thing about their bee yards. It was just one of those years. So you have to pay attention to the weather. Too much rain, that kind of thing.
We talked in the podcast, there was, we started a discussion about the hybridization of, you can say that this morning, but the hybridization of the Russian bees. So your first Russian queen, and then you have preceding queens. And does that affect aggressiveness?
Very, very good point. I think, and that's maybe more where this sort of false assessment of their defensiveness comes from. We're dealing with fairly pure stock, and what that means is that we are actually selecting the drone source that our queens mate with as well. So we got a fairly good idea of how these are going to match up. If you happen to buy a nuke or one of our queens, and then that queen is superseded, or in fact, maybe she swarms and your original queen leaves with the swarm, they replace her with a daughter. Well, the daughter is going to mate with whatever drones are in your neighborhood, and you just don't know what those drones are going to be, what the source of those drones is. So that can have an influence on the next generation. And we refer to those as sort of hybridized Russians. And they're sort of all over the place. They aren't necessarily going to be more defensive, but we've seen certainly accounts where that has happened. So that's another thing to consider. Who are your queens mating with, and how's that going to affect their worker behavior?
Yeah.
The other thing that'll happen around here, if you have skunks or raccoons harassing your bees on a regular basis, they will be nasty. And we have black bears here. And I've always said to people, the worst bees I've ever worked are those where the bears get into the yards and knock the beehives all around. We put on full suits, we tape our ankles, we smoke everything, and we still have a problem with the bees.
Yeah.
But that's because they've been so harassed that they just get really ugly on you. And with that said, keep in mind, if you work with a bee suit or jacket, wash it regularly, because if you get stings on that, those pheromones will stick with you for a month or more. And every time you go out in the bee yard, you're creating an alarm target for the bees. So you might rile your bees up just doing that. And that goes for gloves too. It gets on the gloves. Be careful about that.
That's good. That's good advice for whether you have Russian bees or not. I've seen a lot of pretty grody bee jackets in the bee yard. So I think,
oh yeah,
that's just good advice.
And then, and the last thing I'd say to people who, don't overuse your smoker. Smokers are a great tool for beekeepers, but a little bit of smoke goes a long way. And if you're just blasting those bees, you're going to drive them right out the front of the hive if you're coming from the top. And you know what? They get all riled up that way too. So there's a point where you can overdo it with smoke. So, be discretionary in your use of smoke. And that's a good practice to get into too. We typically will use very little smoke unless we need to.
Yeah. And
all these things. And the other thing I'd just say, one of the things we do have in our bee yards, because our yards often may have 50 to 100 colonies in a location. If we do have a particularly hot colony in that group, we put a little X on it, a red X. And the word there for my employees is that you work that one last. Because if you work it first, you rile up the rest of the bee yard and you have quite a mess on your hands. But leave it till last. Work all the easy ones first, do the hard one last.
Then go home.
Then go home. Exactly. So right. I would say work your bees on sunny afternoons under good conditions. And if you're a hobbyist, that should be the way you work your bees anyway. It's much more enjoyable. Those of us who do this for a living and have to work in the rain sometimes, we find ways to make it work too. And to answer the original question, no, I don't believe that the Russian bees are any more defensive than other types of bees, but there are certainly conditions which will get them going, and you should avoid those.
All right. Well, I guess that's it. Thanks, Dan, for taking your time to address Larry's concern and those expressed by others.
Yep. I hope that does answer your question.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to having you back again.
All right. Well, my pleasure, Jeff. Good talking to you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye.
I'm really glad we got Dan to come back and clarify that point. It's an ongoing controversy, and I don't know if he's put it to rest, but he's certainly cleared up some of the issues with that topic. And I hope it's put kind of some of this to ease so that people are looking more favorable at Russian bees.
Yeah, I was going to say I agree. As I told Dan we've received a couple comments, and I've received a couple comments personally on Dan's episode on Russian bees, and the only thing that's brought up is the aggressiveness. So I'm sure it's going to be an ongoing discussion.
And my experience has always been exclusively the aggressive problem deals with Russian hybrids. It's when people buy pure Russians and let them breed with whatever they've got in the bee yard, and you don't know what you end up with. And that's been the issue. And so to clarify what Dan said, to reinforce what Dan said, deal with pure Russian bees.
Well, good.
And I got to tell you, what we heard from Shane today, it's not often you get this kind of a unique perspective. I mean, he deals with thousands of people buying packages every year, and he knows that some of them walking in are repeat customers from the last 10 years, and some of them are walking in for the first time ever. And that's scary. And anymore, it's even scarier because of not only the fact that they don't know what they're doing and they're not prepared to take care of a live living animal that can sting the heck out of you and your family and your neighbors, but what those bees can do if they become infected with varroa and come and visit my bees. And then suddenly I've got their problem. Our discussion on what do you do about that? Better education, to the point of where he didn't want to go is, if you want bees, show me some proof you know what you're doing. And that's been brought up before. And I know some municipalities have looked at this and gone, you got a live stinging venomous insect in your backyard. Prove to me you know what you're doing. And until you can do that, then we're not going to allow you to have it. They don't let your dogs run wild and let them bite people. And there's all sorts of precedents for this, but I don't think we have to go that far. But I think you said it, he said it, and I think we all put it together is that the industry needs to work harder to get new people on both feet on the ground before they take off.
That would be good. Education's always good.
Yep.
All right. Well, that does a wrap for a good show this week, don't you think?
Yeah, I'm glad Shane could make it. And we want to thank Larry Conner and Wicwas Press, publisher of dozens of how-to and scientific beekeeping books, for sponsoring today's podcast. You can find out more about Wicwas at www.wicwas.com. Take a look at their newest publications and give Larry Conner a high five for bringing all of this great program today. Who we got coming up next?
On our next episode, we have Dr. Samuel Ramsey.
Yeah, that's right.
That'll be good.
That will be good. That will be good. He's an interesting fellow. So, all right. I'll see you then, Jeff.
All right. Thanks, Kim. Talk to you soon. Bye.